April 1945. Somewhere in the heart of a defeated Germany. The war is ending, but not yet over. The roads are broken. Mud, rubble, and silence. Along one of them, a column of German women marches under gray morning light. Their uniforms are faded Luftwaffe blue, field gray, and Red Cross white. Now, all the same color of dust. Each step echoes the collapse of a world. They are nurses, clerks, auxiliaries, once proud members of a machine that promised victory. Now prisoners. Their faces are hollow from hunger and sleeplessness. They carry only small satchels and a faint hope that captivity will be merciful. American trucks idle nearby. Soldiers watch from the roadside, helmets tilted, rifles resting. The air is tense, uncertain. Then something unexpected happens. One soldier steps forward, holding out a bar of soap and a folded towel. No words, just an offering? The women stare, frozen, not understanding. After years of propaganda and fear, this simple act feels impossible. One by one, they reach out, hesitant, trembling. A fragile silence lingers, cleaner than any truce, stronger than any speech. It is the moment when the war, for them, truly ends. By the spring of 1945, the map of Europe was collapsing. What had once been the sprawling territory of the Third Reich was now a labyrinth of ruins, retreat, and surrender. The Allies were closing in from every direction. The British and Americans from the west, the Soviets from the east. Germany, once the aggressor, was now surrounded, its cities burned, its army shattered, and its people trapped in a war that no longer had a future. For years, Nazi propaganda had told its citizens that capture meant torture or death. Posters warned of barbaric enemies, especially the Americans and Soviets. But the truth that met the German soldiers, and particularly the women, was far more complex. By April, over 11 million German soldiers had already fallen into Allied hands. Among them were not only frontline troops, but thousands of women, nurses, communications auxiliaries, Luftwaffe helpers, and Red Cross volunteers. They had worked in hospitals, anti-aircraft batteries, field kitchens, and command offices. Most were between 18 and 30 years old. Some had believed deeply in the Reich. Others had simply been swept along by duty or fear. When the front lines collapsed, these women found themselves stranded. Many units had been overrun before orders to retreat could even be issued. Others surrendered voluntarily, waving white cloths in the hope of mercy. For most, the first encounter with Allied forces came on open roads, unarmed, exhausted, and terrified. The scenes were chaotic. In towns like Remagen, Aschaffenburg, and Halle, American forces advanced through streets littered with civilian refugees, surrendering soldiers, and wrecked vehicles. Among them, groups of German women, some still in uniform, some stripped of insignia, walked with bowed heads, clutching what little they had left. To the Americans, the sight was unusual. For years, the enemy had been faceless. A figure behind a gun, a shape in a bunker, a voice on the radio. Now, the war's human cost stood before them, embodied in frightened young women who had once served that same machine. The U.S. Army had orders to take all surrenders seriously, but discipline was paramount. Every captured German, male or female, was to be disarmed, registered, and processed under the Geneva Convention. American commanders understood that the treatment of prisoners reflected not just their character, but the values for which they fought. But official policy did not erase the moral shock of those moments. Many American soldiers had lost friends and brothers in the brutal campaigns across France, Belgium, and the Ardennes. They carried the memory of destroyed villages, dead comrades, and ambushes under white flags. For them, compassion did not come easily. Yet, when they encountered these women, pale, silent, trembling, something shifted. The hatred that had sustained them through battle faltered in the face of exhaustion and despair. The victors were young men barely older than their captives. They had seen enough death. In one U.S. field report from Bavaria, an officer described arriving at a temporary collection point where dozens of German women sat on the ground, their hands over their faces, refusing to speak. The guards, unsure how to proceed, brought water and rations. They seemed more frightened than dangerous, he wrote. It was not a battle anymore. It was something else. The slow return of reason. For the women, this moment was both an ending and an unknown beginning. Their world, built on uniform, order, and command, had vanished overnight. The Reich had promised them protection and purpose. Now it was gone. They had no home to return to, no certainty of survival, and so they waited, on roads, in barns, in captured villages, for whatever came next. That next moment, for many, would come in the form of an unexpected kindness, a bar of soap, a towel, clean water. Not a victory, but a fragile reminder of civilization itself. When the surrendering German women entered American-controlled zones, they stepped into an organized system that stood in stark contrast to the chaos left behind. The U.S. Army had learned, through years of fighting across Europe, that discipline and procedure were the backbone of victory, even in peace. Every prisoner, regardless of rank or gender, was logged, searched, and processed through temporary enclosure camps, known as transit collecting points. But there was no precedent for this scale. In the final months of the war, Allied forces were detaining up to 60,000 prisoners a day. Roads clogged with captured units. Open fields became makeshift holding pens. Amid this tidal wave of humanity were the women, mostly members of the Wehrmacht auxiliary service, Wehrmacht Helferinnen, Sederinthia Santiu, Senenfeedverein, the Luftwaffe Signals Corps, and the German Red Cross, DRK. They were not treated as combatants in the traditional sense, but neither were they civilians. Most had worn uniforms, carried identification papers, and served under military command. According to the Geneva Convention of 1929, that made them non-combatant military personnel, entitled to humane treatment, but still prisoners of war. American officers often struggled to classify them correctly. In field reports from the 12th U.S. Army Group, it was noted that female personnel attached to enemy units are to be handled with the same procedural respect as soldiers, but with necessary segregation for safety and health reasons. This meant separate enclosures, guarded perimeters, and sometimes isolation from male prisoners. The reasoning wasn't cruelty, it was order. The U.S. command wanted to prevent abuse, maintain discipline, and adhere to international law. Inside these camps, conditions varied widely. In some, especially those set up in former German barracks or schools, the women were given bunks, food rations, and access to water. In others, improvised sites on open fields, they slept under canvas or in the open, exposed to cold spring winds and uncertainty. To the Americans, hygiene was a matter of both morality and military efficiency. Epidemics had devastated armies before. Cleanliness meant control. So, before interrogation or relocation, the women were often ordered to wash. Soap, water, and towels were distributed. Small acts of practicality that, for the prisoners, felt like acts of grace. Many of these women had not washed properly in days, some in weeks. Their uniforms reeked of smoke, sweat, and fear. They expected punishment or humiliation. Instead, they were handed the tools of human dignity. For the American soldiers who witnessed it, the moment carried its own emotional weight. They had come to destroy an enemy, not to shepherd its survivors. Some wrote home about it, describing the strangest feeling to see girls who wore the enemy's uniform now looking like frightened civilians. Others admitted confusion. I didn't know whether to hate them or feel sorry for them. The contrast was most striking when compared to the fate of those captured in the East. In the territories overrun by the Red Army, surrendering German women often faced horrific reprisals: rape, execution, and forced labor. Soviet vengeance was born of years of suffering, and it fell hardest on the defeated. The American zone, by comparison, became a refuge, not of comfort, but of restraint. Discipline, law, and the image of civilization were on the line. The war had already proven how easily men could become monsters. Now came the test of whether they could remain human in victory. It is within this fragile moral space, between order and chaos, hatred and pity, that the story of the soap and towels unfolds. It was not a gesture of luxury. It was a statement: the war is over. You are prisoners, not prey. For many of the women who experienced it, that difference would mark the beginning of a long internal reckoning. They had served a regime built on dehumanization, and now, in defeat, they were offered a glimpse of the humanity it had stolen from them. And in that fragile, silent exchange, something began to shift. Not just between victors and vanquished, but within the very idea of what it meant to be civilized after war. The women who surrendered to the Americans were more than prisoners. They were individuals caught in a war not of their making. Nurses, clerks, typists, and signal operators had once moved through hospitals and command centers with pride, believing that service to the Reich was honorable. Now, the uniforms that had signified authority and purpose hung loosely on gaunt bodies. Their hair, tangled and unwashed, framed pale faces etched with exhaustion. Eyes darted nervously at the soldiers around them, trying to measure intent, searching for hostility or mercy. One young woman, recorded in a U.S. Army field diary, recounted that she did not know whether to cry or run when handed a towel. For her and many others, these moments of care, soap, clean water, a simple towel, felt inconceivable. They had been raised to fear Allied soldiers as brutal, uncaring monsters. Yet here they were, treated with courtesy and dignity. It was a confrontation with reality, stripped of ideology. The war that had consumed their lives ended not with guns or accusations, but with an almost mundane act of humanity. The mental state of female POWs in 1945 was fragile. Years of indoctrination had taught loyalty to a collapsing Reich, while defeat brought confusion, guilt, and terror. Many feared retribution, both immediate and long-term. They had been trained to serve a military machine that glorified obedience. Now they were utterly powerless. The shock of mercy amplified their internal conflict. Receiving soap or towels was not merely hygiene. It symbolized a world in which they were not hated for their gender or service. Letters and interviews from U.S. camps reveal the paradox. Fear of the unknown coexisted with relief, and small kindnesses were imbued with moral significance. Psychologists studying POW behavior note that such gestures can have profound effects on morale and trauma. For these women, the offer of basic care served as a quiet signal. Survival was possible without humiliation. For the men of the U.S. Army, handling female POWs presented a different challenge than combat had. They were trained to confront an enemy head-on, but here, victory required restraint. Orders mandated proper treatment under the Geneva Convention, yet adherence depended on individual judgment in a chaotic environment. Soldiers expressed mixed emotions in letters and diaries. Many had seen death, destruction, and atrocities across Europe. To show mercy required conscious discipline. Offering towels and soap was not an act of softness, but of controlled humanity. The moment encapsulated the paradox of war: power coupled with responsibility. Some soldiers admitted feeling awkward, unsure how to interact without violating either law or propriety. Yet, for many, the act of providing care became a reaffirmation of why they had fought, to uphold the values that differentiated them from the enemy. In the final weeks of the war, acts of mercy were as rare as silence in a battlefield. For the Americans, Offering soap and towels to female POWs was more than procedure. It was a moral statement. It declared that victory did not require cruelty, that humanity could survive even in the aftermath of total war. Military historians note that this was a conscious choice. Unlike the Soviets, whose advance often carried vengeance for years of suffering under Nazi occupation, American forces operated under strict codes. Officers reminded men that adherence to the Geneva Convention was not optional. Mercy, in this context, became a weapon, one of moral authority rather than destruction. The POWs themselves perceived it instantly. A bar of soap, a towel, and clean water signified not only hygiene, but recognition of their humanity. For women who had spent years serving a regime that treated people as expendable, such a gesture was transformative. The story of these female POWs complicates the usual narrative of World War II. They were not frontline combatants, yet many had actively contributed to the war effort. Signal operators relayed orders, clerks managed logistics, and nurses cared for wounded soldiers. Their involvement blurred the line between civilian and military, creating ambiguity in how they were treated upon capture. At the same time, gender influenced perception. Female POWs were often seen as less threatening, but also more vulnerable. American policies recognized this duality. Segregated enclosures, enforced hygiene, and supervision were designed to protect both the prisoners and the troops. The simple act of offering soap and towels, therefore, carried a layered significance. It acknowledged their vulnerability while respecting their dignity. Small, ordinary objects became symbols of a larger truth. A towel or a bar of soap, mundane in normal circumstances, suddenly represented order, care, and the persistence of civilized behavior. In the dust-choked roads of war-torn Germany, where destruction and dehumanization were daily realities, these items were a quiet assertion that humanity had not been entirely extinguished. Historians emphasize that symbolism is often embedded in gestures rather than grand proclamations. The act of giving towels and soap communicated to the women, "You are no longer enemies. You are human beings again." It restored a measure of autonomy, a chance to cleanse the grime of fear, exhaustion, and shame. This scene was not accidental. Field commanders had to make swift decisions in unpredictable circumstances. They balanced operational priorities with legal obligations and ethical considerations. Orders to distribute hygiene supplies were reinforced by officers who understood the significance of small acts in shaping the behavior of both their men and the prisoners. One U.S. officer recorded in his diary, "How we treat the defeated is what defines us, not how we fought the battle." Such reflections reveal that leadership extended beyond strategy or tactics. It included moral courage, the will to act humanely when vengeance would have been easier. For the German women, the Americans were a living contradiction. Years of propaganda had painted them as brutal, merciless, and dangerous. Yet here were men offering care instead of violence. Testimonies describe frozen faces, hesitant hands, and whispered questions. Why? Why are they treating us like this? This cognitive dissonance forced the POWs to confront a truth they had not anticipated. Victory did not always justify cruelty, and defeat did not always demand humiliation. It was a lesson that lingered far beyond the camp, shaping their memory of the war and their understanding of morality in human conflict. The silent exchange of towels and soap was not a story of grand heroism or dramatic battlefield triumph. It was subtle, human, and profoundly transformative. Small gestures illuminated the chasm between war's brutality and the possibility of mercy, a moment in which ordinary objects and ordinary people transcended the ordinary horrors of history. April 1945. A small Bavarian town lies in ruins. Smoke curls from half-collapsed rooftops, and rubble lines streets once bustling with life. The air is heavy with the scent of burned wood and the distant echoes of artillery that have finally gone silent. Here, The war feels suspended, a fragile pause between collapse and occupation. Along the main road, a group of German women is marched under the supervision of U.S. soldiers. They are young and old, nurses and clerks, volunteers and auxiliaries. Their faces are pale, drawn, eyes wide with the uncertainty of what comes next. Some have faint bruises. All are coated in dust and the grime of forced marches. Each step is a reminder of the regime they served and the world that has ended. For the Americans, the arrival of these prisoners is a moment of tense anticipation. Orders are clear: disarm, separate, and register. But in practice, this is uncharted territory. The men had faced enemy soldiers in battle, but these women are unarmed, human, and terrified. There is no plan for the emotional weight of this encounter. The first officer steps forward. His helmet is tilted back, revealing a face worn by months of relentless combat. He surveys the line of prisoners, noting their uniforms, their expressions, the trembling of hands. "Make sure they are secure," he instructs quietly, "and give them water. They are to be treated according to Geneva." Soldiers distribute rations and direct the women to a temporary holding area in a ruined school. Then comes the unexpected act, a small but deliberate gesture. A soldier steps out, holding a bar of soap in one hand and a folded towel in the other. He moves slowly, offering them without a word. The women freeze, some drop their eyes, some clutch their uniforms. Years of fear, of propaganda, of warnings about brutal Americans collide with the reality before them. One nurse, recorded later in an oral history, whispered, "I thought they would shoot us. Instead, they handed me a towel." The soldier does not force compliance. He waits patiently as women step forward, hesitant, trembling. Soap exchanges hands, towels unfold. Water is offered. A murmur ripples through the group. Disbelief, relief, and a fragile, almost guilty gratitude. Observers would later describe the moment as surreal. One American lieutenant wrote in his journal, "I could see the fear and the relief mix on their faces. They were prisoners, yet something in them seemed to awaken. The recognition that the war had ended and that it need not end in cruelty. The significance lies not in the objects themselves, but in what they represented. The towel, clean and soft, became a symbol of order. The soap, fragrant and new, represented care, hygiene, and a return to humanity. In this small act, the soldiers conveyed a larger truth. Victory does not require vengeance. Humanity can survive even after total war. For the women, the emotional impact was immediate. Some wept silently, covering their faces as the absurdity of mercy washed over them. Others stared, wide-eyed, as if witnessing a miracle that contradicted everything they had been taught. This was no battlefield triumph, no shout of victory. It was quieter, subtler, but more profound. The exchange drew attention from nearby American troops. Some struggled to reconcile their own fatigue and anger with the need for compassion, but leadership held firm. Officers reminded men that how they treated the defeated defined not only their honor, but the honor of the army and the nation they represented. This moment marked a turning point, not in the broader strategy of the war, which was already collapsing, but in the psychological and moral landscape of those involved. For the women, it was the first real indication that surrender did not mean annihilation. For the soldiers, it reaffirmed that discipline, morality, and humanity were not casualties of combat. The act of offering soap and towels rippled quietly through the ranks. Whispers spread among the prisoners. The Americans are different. They are not here to humiliate, not here to punish. They are here to enforce order and, paradoxically, to remind the defeated that dignity is not lost. Even in captivity, as the women were led to temporary barracks, many still clutching towels, the town itself seemed to exhale. Ruin and smoke remained, but a subtle human pause had emerged. A moment of grace amid destruction. It was fleeting, yet indelible, a turning point that would be remembered not for battle, but for the quiet restoration of humanity. Inside the temporary holding area, the reality of captivity settled in. Wooden benches, cracked floors, and sparse light from shattered windows framed the women as they tried to make sense of what had just happened. For many, the transition from fear to disbelief was disorienting. They had expected abuse, interrogation, or even violence. Instead, they found order, care, and restraint. One American sergeant moved quietly among them, distributing clean water and ensuring that each woman had the towel she had been given. He spoke in calm tones, simple instructions. Sit. Drink. Wait for your registration. His gestures were precise, practiced, but also humane. For the women, the silence of respect was more jarring than words could have been. The first nurse stepped forward, cautiously washing her face with the water and soap. The scent, unfamiliar yet comforting, filled the cramped room. Others followed, hesitating at first, then more confidently. The ritual of washing, so ordinary in peacetime, became an act of profound psychological relief. With each scrub of the hands or face, a small layer of fear, grime, and humiliation seemed to fall away. Officers oversaw the process, reinforcing discipline among the soldiers. Any hint of condescension or mockery was swiftly corrected. Some young American troops had never before encountered women prisoners in uniform. Their instinct was often a mix of curiosity and tension, but the structured environment allowed them to act responsibly. The scene became an embodiment of command authority tempered with compassion. Outside, the ruined town waited in silence. The distant sounds of artillery had faded, replaced by the soft shuffle of feet, low murmurs, and the occasional cough. In a world torn apart by ideology and violence, this moment created a rare space for reflection. Soldiers and prisoners alike felt its weight. Though neither could fully articulate it, oral histories and post-war testimonies described the effect vividly. One young clerk later interviewed recalled, "I could not believe it. We had imagined the Americans as monsters. Instead, they gave us towels and soap. I thought maybe, just maybe, we could survive this." Another added, "It was the first time in my life I felt like a human again, not just a uniform or a number in someone else's war." This quiet human exchange had broader implications. Officers recognized that the morale of the prisoners could shape future compliance and order. The more the women saw discipline coupled with kindness, the smoother the processing would be. The act of giving towels and soap was therefore both ethical and strategic, a blend of practicality and humanity that reinforced American authority without fear or resentment. Meanwhile, the women's reactions rippled through the camp. Whispers spread quickly. "They are not like the others. They do not hate us." Fear remained, but it was tempered by awe and tentative trust. The line between enemy and survivor blurred, replaced by the simple recognition of shared human experience. By late afternoon, the initial shock had passed. Some women quietly cleaned their uniforms. Others sat on benches, clutching towels, staring at the sunlit dust motes drifting through broken windows. The soldiers observed respectfully, understanding the fragile balance of power and trust. In these hours, the camp transformed from a place of surrender into a space of tentative restoration. For the Americans, the lessons were no less profound. The war had been fought with violence, strategy, and ideology. But here was a reminder that victory could coexist with mercy. One officer wrote in his report, "How we treat those who can no longer fight reflects on the principles we claim to defend. Today, we practiced what we preached." This turning point, the moment when fear met unexpected compassion, marked a shift not in military strategy, but in the human narrative of the war. It revealed that even amid devastation, war's cruelty was not inevitable. The offering of towels and soap became more than a gesture. It became a symbol of moral authority, an assertion that civilization could survive its own destruction. As the women were later relocated to larger processing camps, the memory of that small act lingered. For some, it became a touchstone of survival. For others, a quiet reminder that humanity, even after total war, could endure. And for the American soldiers who witnessed it, the moment affirmed that discipline, courage, and compassion could coexist. That victory need not be cruel. The war outside the town would continue to rage in pockets, but inside this small Bavarian ruin, the turning point had already been etched. Mercy, however modest, had prevailed. The days that followed the surrender were a study in contrast between chaos and order. The women, once terrified of their captors, began to experience a slow, disciplined routine. American officers ensured registration, food distribution, and basic medical care. Each process, however mundane, carried weight. It affirmed that the war had ended for these women, and that they were no longer targets of fear or retribution. Temporary camps were established in towns and abandoned schools. The POWs received blankets, hot meals, and medical attention. For many, these were the first moments in weeks, sometimes months, of relative comfort. Letters from American units describe how even minor acts, like providing clean clothing or a warm bed, dramatically improved morale and compliance. Soap and towels were repeated gestures, reinforcing dignity in a world that had stripped it away. The U.S. Army's attention to hygiene and order was not incidental. After years of mobile warfare, epidemics posed real threats. Disease spread quickly among large, concentrated groups of displaced soldiers and civilians. Washing facilities, clothing distribution, and basic sanitation were practical necessities that coincidentally had profound emotional effects on the prisoners. Reports from the 12th Army Group note that female POWs appeared less anxious and more cooperative after receiving hygiene supplies. They were calmer, quieter, and less likely to resist orders. Officers recognized that this simple measure, soap and towels, fostered compliance while also preserving human dignity. American soldiers continued to observe the women's behavior. Many of the POWs wrote letters home, often smuggling them through Red Cross channels. They described their captors not with hatred, but with a cautious sense of respect. For the first time, the women confronted a reality in which the victors could be humane. Some later admitted to chronicling these moments in diaries. A memory of care that contrasted sharply with the brutality they had seen on the Eastern Front. Meanwhile, the logistical challenge of relocating POWs remained significant. Thousands of prisoners were moved daily to larger processing camps in France and Belgium, or to long-term detention facilities in the American-occupied zones. During these transfers, discipline and civility were maintained, a continuation of the same humane principles demonstrated in the initial encounters. Yet even within this structured environment, tensions remained. Some American soldiers struggled with personal grief and anger over the war's destruction. Others feared that kindness might be perceived as weakness. Officers had to balance emotional restraint with enforcement of regulations. The acts of mercy, however small, became central to this balance, a quiet but persistent demonstration that authority and compassion could coexist. Historical records suggest that the contrast between American and Soviet handling of female POWs left a lasting impression. Women who experienced both zones often described the American camps as orderly and humane, while Soviet captivity involved harsh labor, abuse, and uncertainty. For many German women, this comparison reinforced the moral authority of the Americans and left an indelible psychological imprint. In this first phase of aftermath, the effects were immediate but subtle. Fear and distrust remained, yet gratitude and cautious relief began to emerge. The simple gestures of soap, towels, and clean water transformed a chaotic surrender into a controlled, humane process. It was a quiet but decisive victory for civility, in a war defined by brutality. The stage was now set for the next chapter of their experience: extended captivity, reflection, and the slow process of repatriation. It was in these months, away from the front lines, that the long-term impact of the Americans' early acts of mercy would become most apparent. As weeks turned into months, the female POWs settled into the routines of American camps. The initial shock of surrender faded, replaced by a measured rhythm of registration, medical checks, meals, and hygiene routines. Soap and towels, once astonishing gestures, became part of daily life. Small reminders that, even in captivity, human dignity could persist. Repatriation planning began almost immediately. By mid-1945, U.S. authorities were preparing to return prisoners to Germany as stability gradually returned to occupied zones. Yet the process was slow. Transportation shortages, destroyed infrastructure, and bureaucratic requirements stretched the waiting period. During this time, the treatment the women had received in the early days of captivity set a psychological precedent. It framed the experience of surrender not as total loss, but as survival within a structured, lawful environment. Oral histories collected decades later reveal that many women never forgot those first moments. One former Red Cross volunteer recalled, "I remember the soap. I remember the towel. It seemed so small, but it told me that we were still human, that not everything had been destroyed." Another described the psychological contrast between camps in the West and those in the East, noting how the Americans' adherence to rules and civility shaped her perception of the enemy and of herself. Historical records corroborate these individual experiences. The U.S. Army intentionally maintained humane treatment protocols for female prisoners, ensuring that rations met minimal nutritional standards, clothing was adequate, and medical care was consistent. Reports from camp commandants emphasized that maintaining morale, even among defeated enemies, was essential for order and security. Officers often cited the Geneva Convention as guiding principle, but the implementation extended beyond mere compliance. It was also a moral choice in a war defined by cruelty. In contrast, women who fell into Soviet hands frequently endured forced labor, physical abuse, and sexual violence. Letters and testimonies describe months of fear and deprivation. For the German women in American custody, the contrast was stark. They witnessed that surrender did not always result in violence, that discipline could coexist with compassion. These lessons shaped the survivors' post-war reflections, influencing how they told their stories, reconciled with defeat, and processed trauma. Beyond the camps, the war's end was reshaping Germany itself. Cities were being rebuilt, refugees returned home, and families sought to recover from years of destruction. The women, once prisoners and now on the path to repatriation, carried with them both the physical marks of war, exhaustion, illness, malnutrition, and the psychological weight of what they had witnessed. Yet, for many, the Americans' initial acts of kindness became a touchstone of hope, proof that humanity could endure even after years of ideological violence. By the late summer of 1945, most female POWs had been processed and returned to German territory. Some reintegrated quietly into civilian life. Others entered new occupations or emigrated abroad. Yet in letters, diaries, and later interviews, the memory of those first encounters, the towel, the soap, the quiet, disciplined care, remained vivid. It was a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, ordinary gestures could assert extraordinary meaning. This aftermath was not only about physical survival, but moral survival. For the American soldiers, the event reinforced the principle that victory should not erode humanity. For the women, it became an enduring symbol of dignity restored. The lessons of those days extended far beyond the camps. In small acts, civilization could reclaim itself, even in a world recently ravaged by total war. And from these quiet human moments, The stage is set for reflection, for understanding what this encounter truly meant, not just for those who lived it, but for history itself. History often remembers battles, strategies, and leaders. It celebrates victories and mourns losses. Yet, in the shadow of total war, it is the small human moments that endure. Moments that reveal what civilization truly means. The encounter between American soldiers and German female POWs in 1945 is one such moment. A bar of soap, a towel, clean water, simple objects, yet in the chaos of defeat, they carried profound significance. For the women, those gestures were more than hygiene. They were affirmation that, despite the ideology they had served and the destruction they had witnessed, their humanity remained intact. After months of fear, hunger, and uncertainty, a small act of care shattered the narrative of inevitable cruelty. In a single, silent exchange, they experienced mercy, dignity, and a fragile hope. It was a moment that contrasted sharply with the brutality that had defined the Eastern Front, and a reminder that the rules of war, when honored, can preserve more than life. They can preserve conscience. For the American soldiers, the moment was equally revealing. Years of combat had hardened them. They had seen towns reduced to rubble, comrades killed, and enemies executed. Yet their discipline, guided by law and moral principle, allowed them to act with compassion. Leadership extended beyond strategy. It became a demonstration that victory and humanity need not be mutually exclusive. Through simple gestures, the soldiers reaffirmed that the values for which they had fought were not casualties of war. This encounter resonates beyond its immediate circumstances. It is a testament to the power of empathy amid devastation, to the enduring impact of ethical conduct, and to the subtle ways in which small actions can reshape human experience. Soap and towels, offered in a ruined Bavarian town, became symbols of civilization, fragile yet resilient. In the end, history is not measured solely by maps redrawn or armies defeated. It is measured by the choices people make when they hold power and the humanity they extend when they could easily exercise cruelty. In 1945, in a quiet moment along a dust-choked road, the world witnessed that even after total war, dignity could be restored. One towel, one bar of soap, one human gesture at a time.